American historians have spent very little attention on this imperial army. The soldiers who conquered the Philippines between 1898 and 1902 are dismissed as genocidal racists and criminals. Those who garrisoned the Pacific, which is my topic, for the next 4 decades, largely ignored. In contrast, the apparent collapse of that empire to the Japanese in December 1941, the early months of September of the Second World War, for the United States at least, have been subjected to microscopic scrutiny. I mean, you could literally fill a small library with the thousands of books and articles and documentaries and movies and other media that all seek to explain the background of the twin defeats in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor. But you'd also have to spend quite a few weeks locating any publication that talks of those pre-war forces in any other context except the defeats in December 1941. It's sort of like a victim in a horror movie. You know, it seems the US Army in the Pacific is portrayed as placidly unaware of any danger, ignoring all warnings of imminent, collapse. Oh, there's a scary building, let's go in it. You know, that sort of, I mean, in fact, to most writers, the 40-year history is irrelevant. You know, that Pacific Army exists only to be destroyed by the Japanese and then to draw the appropriate lessons on that. And I think that is the first and perhaps the most important lesson or argument in this paper. American military historians, and I think from listening to my colleagues here, other nations' military historians study peacetime military forces only as pre-war military forces. Rather than focus on the phenomena of how an army recovered from a war, the historians immediately begin rushing forward to find out how it prepared for the next war. And at its worst, this approach delineates a very smooth path of historical causality in which actions and consequences follow each other in very logical progression. Thus, the decision to adopt or ignore a particular doctrine or organization or type of equipment determines results 10 or 20 years later. And the tendency is to ignore all the historical paths that don't contribute to that outcome. And these, by the way, are often the very paths that the peacetime army thought were the most important. And this leads to a second argument, which is a caution against assuming that military institutions evolve because of rational strategic choices made by political and military leaders. Our keynote speaker in his great talk referred to the American Empire. And from our perspective, the American Empire is perhaps, it's almost impossible to believe that it wasn't an inevitable development. But there's seldom been a clearer case of unintended consequences than the United States' experience after the declaration of war with Spain on the 25th of April, 1898. That pre-war peacetime army had no overseas experience. It had no strategic plans for overseas conquest. It had no interest in overseas conquests. I mean, this is an army that is 25,000 officers and men, and some of them are on the western frontier, some are in the harbor fortifications on the Atlantic coast, and there's a small administrative and technical staff in Washington. There's no agency to provide strategic plans or strategic guidance. Among officers, the consensus, at least reading the literature, is the Army's primary mission is continental defense. The primary threat is England, a sudden naval raid on an American American harbor. And when Congress gives the vast sum of $50 million to prepare for war with Spain, and by the way, 50 million doesn't sound like much today. You can win that in the lottery. This is a time when an American soldier earned $13 a month. So 50 million was a lot of money But the Army spent that money rebuilding its harbor fortifications. Yet within 4 years of the declaration of war, the United States acquired a Pacific empire that included the territories of Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, permanent garrisons in China, and some isolated Pacific islands. It simultaneously expanded into the Caribbean, acquiring Puerto Rico, and shortly afterwards, control of the Panama Canal. That empire was conquered with improvised armies and improvised strategy. And so the challenge then, after that war, is to create an imperial strategy and permanent imperial garrisons. Now, every American military historian knows that these imperial wars sparked a significant, almost revolutionary restructuring of the American Army. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the modern American Army dates from those imperial wars of 1898 to 1902. Because afterwards, included an increase of the Army to 100,000, a general staff, the creation of a National Reserve Force, large unit training, modernization equipment, progressive officer education, so forth and so on. But those radical changes were not designed for imperial defense, but to create an army able to fight a Western army in modern European war. Now, the next question, obviously, is having won an empire, how did the army seek to defend it? And this addresses another point in my paper. While historians are very busy explaining what led to the collapse of imperial armies many, many, many years later, they ignore what those imperial armies were doing at the time. So in the immediate post-war era, which is 1902 to 1906, both military officers and their political leaders agreed the Philippines would require a garrison of 12,000, of which many could probably be Filipino. In 1903, they survey Hawaii, and they find that perhaps 2,000 soldiers are needed to defend Hawaii. These predictions soon proved to be over-optimistic. In 1906, even after the Army had recruited 5,000 Filipino soldiers, the Philippines tied up 20,000 soldiers. This is a time when the United States Army, the entire Army, is 68,000. Hawaii also sucked up military personnel. Remember, it was originally 2,000, yet by 1913, its garrison is 7,000. By 1917, it's 15,000. So this burden of empire impeded all aspects of that modernization program I was talking about earlier and created this gigantic break on the creation of this sort of modern American army. Now, what's that army doing? Why does it need so many troops? Well, initially, the problem was internal security. In the years following the declaration of peace in 1902, the Philippine occupation forces suppressed rebellions, brigands, religious cults, Muslim tribes. In short, until 1906 or 1912, the peacetime U.S. Army in the Philippines is not recovering from an imperial war, it's continuing the imperial wars. Now, at the same time these internal campaigns are distracting the imperial army, the external threat is changing. Until 1905, the primary threat is a Western imperial power launching a seaborne raid on either Honolulu or Manila Bay, and once it's taken a port, landing troops, seizing the capital, and then claiming right of conquest. The Americans can't protest because that's what we did to the Spanish in 1898. So that was a great scenario. And the solution is pretty simple. You fortify the entrances to Honolulu and Pearl Harbor and to Manila Bay, and that's what the Army did. And by 1912, these harbor fortifications were judged so powerful that no enemy fleet would ever challenge them. And in fact, none ever did. So they must have worked. But by building these harbor fortifications, the Americans also changed the nature of the threat from a raid by a naval force to a landing from the landward side and attacking the fortifications from the rear. That landward scenario suddenly became a lot more important in 1907 when relations with Japan come very close to war. Army strategists started doing war plans about that time, and they found out that the Japanese could probably land between 70 and 100,000 troops in the Philippines within 10 days of the declaration of war and be at the gates of Manila within 30 days. They also estimated that they could probably do about the same in Hawaii. Now, that leads to a growing division among American military thinkers about Pacific defense, what we might call the continental and the imperial schools of strategic thought. Both concede that Pearl Harbor is the center of American defense. If you have a map, you can see that no one can attack the West Coast without going through Hawaii first, and especially in the days of coal-powered battleships. Continental defense policy says a line from Alaska, Hawaii, Panama Canal, a sort of defensive barrier behind which America can protect itself. They say anything further than that can be protected by the US Navy, and it's not our business anyway. The Philippines have no strategic value. The imperial school argues that the Philippines are a jumping off point, if you want, power projection. They allow the United States to exert enormous influence in Asia and the Far East, and therefore they need to be held. Both sides alternate. Neither side is triumphant. Some people would argue this debate still goes on today between people who want to pull back to a fortress America and people who argue for power projection and America in the Far East. But it's never resolved during this period. So we fast forward to the period after World War I. Again, Pacific defense is very important, but again, the resources are not there. 1922, the American Congress cuts a national defense plan that had called for 300,000 professional soldiers to 132,000 soldiers. Now, under the National Defense Plan, the Philippines and Hawaii both have 30,000 man garrisons that are ready, air, land, sea, harbor defense, so forth. But after the 1922 cuts, the Philippine garrison has 12,000, of whom less than 5,000 are American, and Hawaii is always under 15,000. So how do the Pacific commanders react to this dilemma? Do they, as legend has, sit around drinking, playing polo, and beating up on the natives? No. Actually, if you study them, they did a pretty good job. And I'm just going to give you two examples. Well, one of these is Major General Charles P. Summerall, who's in Hawaii. Now, Summerall is in Hawaii, and he's looking at the National Defense Plan. And this is very optimistic, or the war plan against Japan. And largely due to the Navy, because the Army always, U.S. Army always has a real bad problem. It believes the Navy. And later on, after they had an Air Force, it believes the Air Force too. It's incredible how gullible these people are. So the Navy says, yeah, we can get there. So the Army's plan is to put every soldier, now remember this is a cut-down Army that's left, 133,000, and send them to the Philippines as fast as possible. Summerall is in Hawaii, and he says, this is a disaster. Hawaii is the center of, should be the center of defense. So he develops a very detailed defense in depth. Remember, he's a World War I veteran. One thing he knows is defense in depth and how to protect. And he develops a very good Oahu defense plan. It's tested on numerous maneuvers and exercises. In fact, I would argue that one of the reasons the Marines are so good at amphibious assault is they went up against the United States Army's beach defenses in the interwar period. And that's why they had to be good. Now, in 1928, Summerall becomes Chief of Staff, and he takes the Hawaii Defense Plan and he inserts it into the war plan with Japan. In doing so, he accepts the continental defense strategy, that the Philippines are going to be lost, but Hawaii will be defended. And that's a very logical argument, and I would say it was logical in 1928, and in 1932, and, just all the way up to 1941. And I think there's a lot to be said for the eventual American victory in recognizing that Hawaii is the center of Pacific defense. But from people who look backwards, 1924 is a terrible year because that's the year that Billy Mitchell, the American aviation pioneer, goes out to Hawaii and he writes a plan in which he predicts a Japanese aerial attack on Pearl Harbor even down to Sunday. They're going to come Sunday morning and they're going to destroy Pearl Harbor. And to Mitchell's supporters, Summerall and his brass hat, ground-bound conservatives, how do they respond? They suppress that report, they court-martial Billy Mitchell and kick him out of the Army, and the result, of course, is the inevitable disaster in December 1941. It was all there, but they ignored it. Well, let's step back and look at it from the perspective of the officers in 1924. They don't know Billy Mitchell is a prophet. They know he's insubordinate, he's ambitious, he's treacherous, he's headline grabbing, he's promiscuous, he's a drunk, and his military career is in tailspin. That's the Billy Mitchell they know. And if they know him better, they know he makes predictions about destruction all the time. He's the one, and I hate to say this in front of my Austrian colleague, who says that in 1915, Austria-Hungary has the ability to invade the United States. Now think of it. You think they had other things? You heard it first here. When it happens, don't say you weren't warned. Perhaps most importantly, unlike most writers, Summerall, his staff, the Army Chief of Staff, the Army General Staff, even the Army Chief of Air Service, read Mitchell's report. They read it in its entirety. And they recognized it's not really a Pacific Defense Plan. It's a manifesto articulating Mitchell's belief that the United States has an obligation, and I'm going to quote here, of maintaining not only the political supremacy, but also the very existence of the white race. That's Mitchell. There's other things that Mitchell's report doesn't mention. He thinks Alaska, not Hawaii, is the center for an American-Japanese war. He also says that Japan, which had just built its first military aircraft with British help, is the second biggest air force in the world. He says, at a time when an American bomber has a range of about 1,000 kilometers, that the Japanese have bombers that can fly from Midway to Hawaii, a distance of 2,000 kilometers. This is a time when open water navigation was not even attempted. And yet, the Japanese are going to do this. And perhaps the best thing that Mitchell says is, there is nothing whatever to fear from so-called naval aircraft carriers. So, in conclusion, between 1898 and 1902, the United States acquires an empire by accident. It did so with improvised armies, improvised strategy, and over the next 3-4 decades, it has to create imperial armies and imperial strategy to defend that. And we all know the ultimate fate of that army. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, followed by the humiliating collapse of the Philippine garrison to a numerically inferior Japanese force. And it's very tempting to draw a direct line between the establishment of that peacetime imperial army and all its defects, and then what happened. And from there, you can identify the culprits, the bad decisions, the inadequate weapons, and so forth that led to that collapse. But that's simplistic, and it's ahistorical, it's anachronistic, and I would say it's not only unhelpful to historians, it's unhelpful to today's military officers, because they don't know, like historians know, what's going to happen in the future. And so it sounds obvious, but I think we need to study peacetime imperial armies, and I'd say peacetime armies in general, as distinct entities, not as institutions we know are destined for collapse or for victory. It's fun to highlight the blunders. Everyone likes to be a hanging judge, and you. But it's probably more helpful to those working on today's strategic problems, imperial or not, to just say, here's the problems they faced. They're probably somewhat similar to the problems you're facing, and here's how they tried to resolve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was the best joke I've ever heard. Unbelievable. I have to tell my friends from the Naval Historical Office, Austrian-Hungarian Navy attacking United States. We couldn't even leave the Adriatic Sea anyway. So really fantastic. Well, I tried to keep you awake during the first panel after lunch with the fascinating and, let's say, thrilling history of the more or less provisional first army of the, let's say, first provisional newly founded republic of the, let's say, provisional newly founded new provisional government of Austria after the armistice in November 1918. Well, November 1918 can certainly be regarded as a crucial turning point, not only for Austria's political history, but also for the history of the Austrian armed forces in general. The end of the imperial and royal monarchy of the House of Habsburg also brought about the end of the old and traditional army, whose eldest regiments had a long-lasting tradition of almost 300 years. After a struggle, well, more or less, which lasted almost 4.5 years, from which more than 1 million soldiers of the Austro-Hungarian ranks did not return, and of which about 600,000 had died directly on the battlefields, World War I ended for Austria-Hungary with the armistice of November 3rd, 1918. At that time, the monarchy was already decaying. The provinces formerly belonging to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the so-called crownlands, had declared their independence, what a pity, and had already started to develop primary political structures, including the organization of their respective militaries. For German Austria, which was designated to be the succession state for all Germans within the monarchy and therefore seemed to be doomed to suffer the fate of a rump state, a torso, due to the drift of the developing succession states as early as October and November, a solution to the issue of defense was not only fundamental, but also a question of survival, especially since the borders of the new republic could not be regarded as safe. The left painting shows the first gathering of the provisional former members of the Austrian parliament in Vienna, and the second, the famous manifest of Emperor Charles I and the last, of some kind of, let's say, self-governance of the different nationalities. When we have a close look at the events happening during the second half of October and beginning of November, it shows that not only the beginning of World War I from the Austrian side was some kind of stumbling in, but also the exit of World War I was some kind of stumbling out. The decay and disintegration of the Habsburg Empire was developing so quickly that nobody really had a clear plan or idea how the transition or the liquidation of the former empire can be done properly. Well, as we all know, Villa Giusti, the Italian High Command, where the Austrian delegation for the ceasefire had signed the ceasefire, the unconditional ceasefire with Italy on the 3rd of November 1918. And of course, we made a big mistake because we announced the armistice too early. And it was signed on the 3rd of November, but it came into action on the 4th of November. But sometimes you should read the contract very clearly. And the Austrian forces stopped their fight about 20 hours too earlier, which caused about 300,000 imprisonment. Anyway, I love these Austrian stories. On the other hand, because of the armistice, those troops who were not captured by the Entente forces tried to get home, to go home, to join their newly founded republics. The symbols were thrown away and new symbols were there. So it was very, very chaotic what happened. And most of these troops try to go through the territory of German Austria to reach their new countries. Well, At this time, in the backlands, in the early November days, those soldiers who were at home declared quite clearly what way of history they were focusing and wanted to have. The old imperial symbols, cocards, were thrown away. Red, white, red for some kind of Austrian republic. Others wanted to join Germany, black, red, and yellow. Or Austria, navy, a navy with no sea, very interesting. Or simply back in the right, red for some kind, let's say, Bolshevik or lefty government. Preliminary considerations regarding the creation of a new Republic of German Austria continued into the final stages of World War I. What is interesting, because the empire was still existing when they were already thinking over how this new republic could be founded. When the German-speaking delegates to the Reichsrat, I've shown the picture before, assembled in Vienna's Herrengasse on October 21st, 1918, basic features of the future administration were established, and only a few days later were then accepted as provisory but nevertheless binding guidelines for the new constitution and administration. In place of the former ministries, very imperial, there would be public offices or Staatsämter, as they were called, which were to be headed not by ministers but by secretaries of state or vice secretaries of state. And there was, of course, also demand for, let's say, independent armed forces. Especially their raising, structure, and organization were of major importance immediately following the foundation of the new public office of military on 1st of November 1918. Just think over, the monarchy was still existing, although there was already a Republican Ministry of Defense. The newly created public office of military was headed by a German nationalist, Josef Meyer, to whom Vice Secretary of State Dr. Julius Deutsch, left-wing party, and Dr. Erwin Weiss, conservatives, were assigned. Left Deutsch, who was very important for the Volkswehr, and right is the first commanding general. Concerning the structure and organization of the new Republican Army, tangible considerations already existed on the social democratic side and only on the social democratic side. In order to demonstrate a clear and very clear break to the old royal and imperial military tradition, also on the organizational level, the armed forces should be organized like a militia, Swiss system, on the basis of a general military draft with low active standards. This consideration included all, let's say, German territories, resulted in a thought to organize 20 infantry divisions, very funny. But an immediate introduction of a general military draft seemed hardly promising due to the fact that World War I had just ended and there was an overall general fatigue from warfare and military. Consequently, an interim arrangement was decided upon, namely the creation of a Volkswehr, formed by professional soldiers who were committed to a certain length of service. The promotion for these new armed forces started immediately after the armistice of November 3rd, 4th. In order to reach a certain level of forces promptly, the high pay of 6 crowns per day, this is triple the wages of a normal worker, was granted. After basic agreement upon the guidelines of formation on November 8th, the factual order of creating the Volkswehr was issued on November 15, 1918. At that time, a commander-in-chief of the Volkswehr had already been inaugurated, Lieutenant General Adolf von Pogg, an imperial officer. In his speech during the inauguration, the president of the Council of State, Karl Seitz, not only outlined the duties of the Volkswehr, but also clarified that there will be no continuity with the old army of the dual monarchy. Also, it had to be conceded that it would not be possible without the utilization of trained soldiers and officers of World War I. However, this ambivalence became more than obvious with the appointment of Adolf von Pogg, the right man, a highly educated and experienced commissioned officer and a general staff member who was distinguished as a front commander. The need for some kind of military forces seemed to be inevitable, since the borders between the newly establishing succeeding states would be quite problematic. It's the fantastic perspective Vienna had in 1918, which should be part of German Austria. These are all the German settlements, and compared to today's to today's Austria, it's a little bit larger, as you can see. And the other new states were quite quick in raising their armies. The incoming troops from the front line just changed their symbols and got new symbols, and suddenly they had big and strong armies. The issue of defense of German areas seemed to be fundamental, so Volkswehr units should also be raised in this area, not under control from Vienna. This was really, really naive. First, the force level of the Volkswehr was limited to 1 infantry battalion, which was made up of 3 companies for each political district. According to the federal principle, the commander-in-chief of each province, including Southern Bohemia, Southern Moravia, German Bohemia and Sudetenland, should act as superior authorities with official residences in Vienna, Graz, Innsbruck, Leitmeritz and Troppau. The maximum force of the public militias was precisely defined for each territory, we can see it, and comprised a total of about 50,000 soldiers. The State Secretary of Military, which had already been mentioned earlier, functioned temporarily as a supreme political authority. On the one hand, it had to supervise the formation, the extension of the public militia, and on the other hand, it already had to think about the transformation of the Volkswehr into a militia-based regular army in the next future. Additionally, a so-called civic commissioner's office, Zivilkommissariat, was integrated into the State Secretary of Military, which dealt with the evidence of rules and regulations concerning recruitment, the operation of services, provisions and accommodations. Besides that, it also concerned itself with instructing the men of the public militia about their civic duties and rights, as well as with the advancement of democratic principles within the Volkswehr. This can also be regarded as a deliberate break to the old military traditions of the imperial and royal monarchy, and giving quite a lot of political influence, especially to the Socialist Party. Not only the commanding officers of the battalions, but particularly the members of the so-called soldier councils, it was the Soviet model, who were men of confidence of each battalion, were the links to the civic commissioner's officer. Each company appointed 2 soldiers and each battalion appointed 2 officers for these boards. Additionally, distinguished soldiers without school-leaving certificates had now the possibility to reach the status of an officer, so-called Volkswehr lieutenants. This tradition, however, was very frequently abused, since potential aspirants had to be appointed by the Council of Soldiers, and so political aspects were frequently of greater significance than qualifications. Regarding the different Volkswehr unit, it was obvious that most of the soldiers, especially in Vienna and in the towns, were more or less strongly tending to the political left wing. Especially that during the breakdown of the monarchy, newly formed communistic Red Guard seemed to be dangerous to the new republic. During the foundation ceremony of the republic on the 12th of November 1918, there started already the first revolt, so they were not waiting even a minute. To get them under control, this was very daring. They were integrated into the Volkswehr structure as battalion number 41, but luckily in spring 1919 they got the allowance to join the Hungarian Red Forces in the wars against Romania and in Hungary, and I think in Vienna everybody was happy that all 1,200 men did not come back anyway. This is a possibility of getting rid of soldiers you don't want. Regarding the uniforms and symbols, the total break of the old traditional army was very clear. Interesting, we totally copied the first army regulation of the Weimar army, because it was clear that the new government wanted to be part of Germany, and the integration of the Austrian battalions could be easier when the uniforms had already the rank system of the so-called Weimar Reichswehr. It was interesting, the rank system was done on the sleeves, and the famous stars we still have on our uniforms had to be replaced, and they were replaced by stripes, more or less quite familiar with the Navy, but we had no Navy anymore, so this was more or less quite clear. And second, what was also quite clear, no brigade or divisional level was established, because it looked more easy to be integrated in the German army if you have just battalions and no brigades or divisions. Well, what is also quite funny, the Volkswehr established also a Volkswehr Navy. on the Danube, which is quite interesting. This was done not because it was necessary to have a navy there, but quite a lot of former navy men volunteered for the Volkswehr, and they didn't want to change their uniform, so they had their blue uniform, and then it was said, what should we do? So we had the Volkswehr navy on the Danube, no ships, but plenty of soldiers and navy men, so it was quite funny what they did at this time. Well, if we come to some conclusion, what was the main effect? And here we see the main effect of the Volkswehr was more of an internal effect. We can see here soldiers of the Volkswehr Battalion number 25 in the Houses of Parliament, because there were permanently some communistic riots and rebels, and so the main issue of the Volkswehr was not fighting for borders or territories, but to fight for internal stability. Most of the enemy at this time were, of course, communist and Bolshevik Red Guards. But on the other hand, there was also defending borders, especially the southern border towards the new establishing state for the South Slavs, later on Yugoslavia. They were very much interested to take territories which they thought, because of history, should be theirs. Klagenfurt, Graz, the southern borders. And there, the big discussion started, especially in Vienna, because the Vienna High Command of the Volkswehr said, well, is it now very clever to fight against the Yugoslavian state? Because maybe this is not very good during the negotiations for the peace treaty in Saint-Germain. So Vienna was not very happy that there should be fightings. And at the beginning, they ignored any asks for help from the southerners. So the people in Carinthia and later on in Styria organized themselves and fought against the South Slavic enemies, and this is still very, very heavy in the brains of people living in Carinthia and sometimes in Styria. And more or less they were, regarding Carinthia, they were successful. Regarding Styria, they were not very successful. So the whole story of the Volkswehr units was going down already before the peace treaty of Saint-Germain was signed, because they were quite costly, 50,000 men, and needed enough money. So already from summer to fall 1919, the number of soldiers was going down and going down and going down. And because of the peace treaty of Saint-Germain, a Volkswehr or a militia was not allowed, so this was the end of the Volkswehr, provisional, but provisional. Thank you very much.
We continue with the next speaker. He takes us up north to the Nordic area, and he will guide us in the Finnish War of Independence. The next speaker is Dr. Pasi Torninen, who teaches military history and military geography at the University of Eastern Finland, and he also teaches at the Finnish National Defense University. Please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It might be quite odd for you to hear about winter warfare now that we are in the, let's say, warmer climate here in Israel and the Middle East, but maybe my perspective will cool us down a little bit. Let's see what happens. The season really matters in warfare, and in the northern regions, winter in particular significantly affects troops' operational capabilities. When winter sets in, the ground and waters freeze and most of the natural obstacles disappear. Winter can hamper movement and disrupt logistical support, yet troops have not usually gone to winter quarters in the European north, because winter can also aid military operations if one possesses over-snow mobility. However, fighting in deep snow, ice, cold weather, and darkness requires thorough preparations that provide combatants and units with the ability to survive, live, camp, and move and fight in those special conditions. The conditions can also be utilized to achieve military success, but with difficulty if the idea of exploitation has not been incorporated into doctrine and tactics. The Finns did this during the interwar period, but the situation during the First World War was quite different. Finland gained its independence from Russia in 1917, and we can say that the country was born as a child of the First World War. At the time, Finnish military traditions had been discontinued because the Russians had abolished the Finnish military in 1905. Therefore, the Finns did not have hardly any expertise in winter fighting or fighting at all. In fact, the ensuing War of Independence, which is also called the Civil War of 1918, fought in early 1918, was fought by amateurish white and red armies that had been hastily formed and were neither properly trained nor equipped for winter combat. This paper analyzes how these two inexperienced belligerents managed to deal with the challenges posed by winter, that is, to overcome the conditions and harness the elements, and whether either side made any genuine attempts to exploit the natural conditions to their advantage at the tactical level of war. In addition to tactical methods, the points discussed are organization and training, equipment, mobility, logistical support, command and control, and cover, all in terms of how winter affects them and how they can be utilized. Beforehand, it's imperative to introduce the military geography of southern Finland where the war was fought. The Finnish War of Independence broke out in mid-winter on 27th of January 1918. The bulk of fighting took place when the snow was still on the ground, and only the last weeks of the war, which ended with white victory on the 15th of May, were fought in the almost snowless conditions of spring. Terrain analysis informs us that the military geography of southern Finland, where the majority of the battles between the whites and reds took place, was characterized by forests, lakes, and small fields. The trees had an impact on visibility, limiting both observation and fields of fire. The leaves of coniferous trees did not drop leaves in winter, and the bullets easily ricocheted off their branches. On the other hand, a forested terrain and the long periods of darkness, typical features of northern winter, provided the troops with good opportunities for cover and concealment, and potentially excellent chances for achieving surprise. The battlefield was practically everywhere when lakes, marshes, and ground froze, but digging in was complicated. Snow, even the surfaces, and deep snow was an obstacle that hindered movement. The cold weather made the need for shelter more urgent. In winter, in an area with a relatively flat topography, there were plenty of potential avenues of approach, and even traditional winter roads constructed on the ice of lakes could serve as shortcuts, attack routes for encircling units, or escape routes from besieged places. The White Army were the government troops with regimental and brigade structures. It consisted of the Civil Guard, Defense Corps, conscripted Jägers, that is light infantry, and other young units. The rebellious Red Guards were mainly formed on a voluntary basis by men of varying ages. They were organized into companies that suited the realities of the war well, since it was almost impossible to use large formation in the wintry forests. Despite the long tradition of using ski troops in the Nordic countries, the White Army only had a few ski companies and only one designated ski battalion. The Reds had none at all, just individual skiers. Both belligerents mainly deployed their ski troops for reconnaissance duties. The German-trained Jäger officers and NCOs, that is the leadership cadre of the White Army, had at best little first-hand experience of winter combat. The Finnish volunteers of the 27th Royal Prussian Jäger Battalion of the Imperial German Army had been used as a ski battalion in the Battle of the Aa River in Latvia in early 1917, but harsh weather conditions then disrupted plans for a counterattack there. The Finnish White Army's first tactical manual included brief instructions on the use of ski troops. Edited by Jägers and published in the late 1917, it was too late to have much impact on the training of the Whites. Neither side gave its troops any specialized winter training, and in the pressurized situation, training periods were often very short. Thus, the level of training of many White troops was inadequate, but the young Jäger troops were the best trained. Even though Red training was in many cases inferior in comparison, the Red Guards, used to working on small farms and in the forests, had better fieldcraft skills and were, in most cases, better fit for frontline duties and the realities of war in the existing sub-zero winter conditions than their White adversaries. Both sides suffered from poor equipment. At the outset of the war, the Reds had better weapons than the Whites because they had received them from the Bolshevik Russians. Yet, towards the end of the war, the armament situation was turning in favor of the Whites because of German aid. A few soldiers were issued proper footwear. Only some White troops had proper thick wool uniforms and Laplanders' big boots. A great majority of the troops on both sides wore their own civilian layered protective winter clothing that usually provided sufficient warmth. As stated before, mobility is a key factor in winter warfare. The terrain would have provided opportunities for ski troops to be used as fast enveloping movements, even double-sided, and guerrilla tactics against the exposed flanks. Yet, the poor level of training, lack of skis, poor oversnow mobility placed serious restrictions on the use of troops that were actually, in most instances, road-bound. The White leaders chose to use existing troop roads for troop movement and tactical action. For the same reason, securing the lines of communication and supply often became the main objectives and the key terrain in belligerent operations. Consequently, the main art of war employed has been called sled column tactics. Long marching columns of sleds and foot soldiers were a typical formation in Finland in 1918. The offensive preparations usually took a long time in winter and were difficult to keep secret. On one occasion, the Whites had to gather 500 horses from a hinterland spanning 100 kilometers. Thus, the belligerents were completely unable to achieve surprise as the defender could determine the exact arrival time and the size of the attacking force. The lack of skis also led to the habit of conducting costly frontal attacks. Troops in extended order waded in deep snow over open terrain. The slow-moving attack line formations were no match for well-placed machine guns. The reserves were used to extend the flanks. Only towards the end of the war we can see some attempts by the Whites to use ski troops for outflanking movements. Yet neither side could properly synchronize fire and movement in the winter of 1918. Neither Whites nor Reds had heated tents or enough mobile field kitchens, nor did either side possess any combat baggage for quick ammunition replenishment or medical service, which complicated decisive and fast action. This was an impediment to operations, as in winter, in order to maintain combat effectiveness, up to 50% more calories were required. Food supplies were acquired at the local level, and often companies and battalions had to bake their own bread. The supply, logistic, and maintenance considerations were overriding, and practically all tactical actions were confined to the proximity of houses and supply lines. Therefore, the troops did not normally take up defensive position in tactically advantageous ground behind choke points, but rather at the outskirts of villages where the troops could bivouac. Seldom did the belligerents camp out in the open, in the forest. Typically, white and red troops abandoned some occupied ground in exchange for shelter and a place to cook meals. It goes without saying that this ran counter to the principle of rapid exploitation of opportunities and even prolonged the war. The battles were usually fought near the villages for medical reasons too. In cold weather, the wounded needed swift evacuation to somewhere warm. So trains and horse-drawn sleds were used to provide logistical support. Neither side did receive proper artillery support because of the small number of artillery pieces, their light calibers, and unsophisticated firing methods. Moreover, the impact of artillery shells was practically nullified in snow and against troops in snow positions. Therefore, the artillery on both sides mainly targeted existing buildings that housed command posts and troops, employing a type of scorched earth tactic. Despite the obvious tactical benefits, snowy forests were avoided because units needed to be kept under command and the lines held. Command was affected by the lack of signal equipment. Neither belligerent had radios or enough field telephones for effective communication. Instead, they used existing telephone lines when available, and the only method or real method of communication for tactical leadership was the use of ski orderlies, and that was not fast. It was almost impossible to dig into the frozen ground, making it difficult to obtain the advantage of terrain to get protection from indirect and direct fire and observation. If ditches or embankments were not available, the positions, foxholes, or shallow trenches were constructed in snow and covered with spruce and pine sprigs. Sometimes the defensive positions were reinforced with frozen logs and layers of frozen snow or pulp bales. Winter in the north is the darkest time of the year, something like 4 or 5 hours of daylight around the turn of the year. The fighting normally took place during the short daylight hours, and the hostilities normally ended for the night only to resume at daybreak, because it would have been very difficult to lead inadequately trained troops in the dark. Marksmanship was relatively poor on both sides, and this problem was further aggravated by darkness, which impacted on accuracy. Their soldiers generally tended to aim and fire too high in the dark. Completed with camouflage clothing, white camouflage clothing was not standard among the troops, so they did not always blend with their wintry environment. This was often a missed opportunity to achieve cover, hide actions, and limit casualties in forests, let alone in open areas. On the other hand, as the spring advanced and snow started to melt, white camouflage became a liability. To conclude, the Finnish War of Independence was fought by inexperienced and badly prepared armies that failed to exploit the winter conditions to their advantage. The bold use of ski troops could have improved chances of success, but it was not used, with the exception of some attempts by the whites at the end of the war. Both belligerents encountered problems related to the terrain and weather that were characteristic for winter warfare. The tactical methods employed on each side were rather simple. For supply and bivouacking reasons, troops were tied to the area they were defending. However, the War of 1918 was a learning process for the victorious White Army. It carefully studied the lessons of this War of the Amateurs and started to develop the winter and forest warfare expertise that was to become the major strength of the Finnish military by the eve of the Second World War. In the winter of 1939-40, the invading motorized and mechanized and almost ski-less Red Army was often dependent upon the road network along the Soviet-Finnish borderlands. Thus, its performance in the Winter War resembles that of the Finns in 1918. 2 decades later, the Finnish army, the successor of the White Army of 1918, with its ski troops and ability to camp in the trackless wilderness, was able to exploit the winter conditions and even use them as a force multiplier. Thank you.
With nice pictures of snow, and we need some snow here, I guess, because it can be awfully hot outside. I hope I don't hope we will have a hotter debate. I hope you will have the fire in you to pose questions to our 3 speakers. The rules of the games are very simple. Please start by posing your giving your name and the National Commission, and then ask your question to one of the speakers. Who may I give the floor, the micro? Dr. Corum, please state your name.
James Corum, American.
Could you use the micro, please?
James Corum, American Commission. I have a question for Pasi Tunainen, and that is what the Jaegers were all veteran, experienced soldiers who probably would have had a good deal of tactical competence. Of course, General Mannerheim is an old Russian army veteran. How many of the white officers had been veterans of the Russian army, and how many of the soldiers? Because Finland had not had conscription, I believe, in the Tsarist Empire. So how many of the Finnish soldiers were experienced veterans, and how many were newly trained?
Thank you for the question. Finns had some experience from the Russian army. We had actually some battalions part of the Imperial Russian army, and also we had some reserve units, but they did not do a lot of training in winter conditions. I only have seen some pictures of units on skis in parades and things like that. So these reserve companies, for example, that were scattered around the country, they only practiced in summertime. So it was not; they were not used in winter conditions at all. But the standing army battalions, I assume that they had some expertise in winter fighting, but they were not used outside the Finnish territory, and there were no wars going on in that area. There had been only used in the Balkans in the 1870s. The Finnish Guard was operating in the mountains of the Balkans, but experienced some, but that's too long ago to have an effect on this time. Mannerheim himself, as you mentioned, he was a Tsarist officer, and there were some other high-ranking officers too coming from the Russian army, but as a matter of fact, later on by mid-20s they were replaced by these younger generation, these German-trained Jaegers and some other younger generation officers. But yes, they did have some, but I wouldn't stress the importance of this experience.
The back, our Danish colleague, I guess. In the back, yes, sir.
Thank you. You're almost right. I'm Niels Poulsen, not from Finland, but from the Danish Commission. And my question goes to Professor Tunainen as well. Normally, and I know your paper was about tactics, but I will ask you to elaborate a little bit on the atrocities committed during the Finnish civil war. Normally, when you read the literature, you will see that the atrocities committed by both sides during the civil war, they are either explained by the impact of ideology, or they are explained by triggering a cycle of retaliation. But your paper made me wonder if there's also a structural explanation to the atrocities, namely that under these winter conditions, it must have been very difficult to keep a large number of prisoners and feed them and so on. So I wonder if you would comment a little bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I never thought of that from that perspective, and to be honest, I haven't studied our 1918 war that much. I'm a more of a specialist of the Second World War, so perhaps. But what I have read, and I have to rely on other scholars here. So basically, it was a question of revenge. There were some atrocities committed on both sides, murders even, and then they were kind of punished by these atrocities. So I would say that this is the main reason. The distances were short, so it would not have been very difficult to take the prisoners and take them somewhere to the rear, even in these conditions.
The next question goes to our Cameroon colleague.
Okay, I want to ask a question, but as I'm listening from the tradition in French, I will only ask the question in French because maybe what I want to ask is mostly be understood in French. Please, thank you. Alors, ma question s'adresse au docteur Passy, Tonamé. Pendant son exposé, j'ai suivi au moins 2 fois dans la traduction lorsqu'on a parlé de l'expression armée blanche. Bien, je dois dire que c'est la première fois que j'entends cette expression parce que nous sommes là dans la période de la Première Guerre mondiale. Au cours de cette période, nous le savons, les forces noires d'Afrique ont combattu aux côtés des Français et des Anglais. Bon, si on parle de l'armée noire, dans ce cas-là, cela peut se comprendre puisqu'on parlait des forces noires. Bon, maintenant, pour nous, Africains, si un Africain moyen entre dans cette salle maintenant, et s'il regarde dans l'ensemble, il va voir des gens, il va dire que ce sont des Blancs. Qu'ils soient asiatiques, européens ou américains. Bon, du coup, lorsqu'on parle d'armée blanche dans ce contexte-là, je me demande à quoi on se réfère. Je n'ai pas bien compris pourquoi on n'a pas utilisé l'expression armée blanche pour dire par exemple que cette armée s'est bien préparée désormais après la Première Guerre mondiale à mieux se pouvoir pour mieux mener la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Merci.
Okay, thank you for the question. So your question was pretty much about the ethnicity issue, whether white army was in fact Caucasian army. Yeah, in the Finnish question, of course, all the soldiers were Caucasian white soldiers, but in this respect, it's about ideology and even party politics. So white refers to government troops, the conservative, and what we have, the so-called center party, which is kind of in the political spectrum on the right side, and the red guards were socialist and even some communists among them. So it's about political division, and it's about ideology, and not anything about race or ethnicity.
I was saying that it is, if it is the expression known already, then it's okay. Because as I said, this is the first time I'm hearing talking about the White Army. And I just wanted to know what it means. It did not mean automatically it is for the ethnic. Thank you.
And thank you for your answer. Mr. Klebanov, Israel.
Alon Klebanov, Israel. First of all, as a weapon expert and a continuation of your remark, how on earth do you operate a water-cooled machine gun in the snow? That's something I would think of, my God. But the main question is to Brian. Brian, you've mentioned a sort of mixture of defensive strategy, basically fortifying positions which have been taken long before. So it's consolidation of, let's say, the military achievements of the American-Spanish War. But as you mentioned, the Japanese, in 1922, in Portsmouth, there is an attempt to limit the Japanese Navy. So it's basically already some kind of feeling or understanding that Japan might be an enemy in the Pacific. So how would America combine defensive and offensive strategy in the Pacific? Did it have one, and how did it think about sort of balancing the two? Thank you.
Well, the sort of little-known fact is that Japan was the enemy, the primary enemy, certainly for the U.S. Navy, and increasingly, I'd say, for the U.S. Army by 1907. And in fact, in part because of the racism of the California school system, which excludes Japanese from public schools on the grounds that Asians can't compete with white people. If you know anything about the California school system now, you'll appreciate the irony of that. And in part because Japan was very angry at the United States for what it viewed as its interference in the Russo-Japanese War. So Americans had really sort of dismissed any possibility of a large force being able to land in the Philippines or Hawaii because they're looking at European competitors. But in 1904, of course, the Japanese fight the Russians, and they're able to not only put large forces on the Asian mainland, but sustain them. And that changes the perspective of the threat from maybe 12,000 people to 100,000 people. And that is when, 1907 is when you first see the war plans against Japan that later become called the Orange Plan, which is a misnomer because it was the Orange Plans. They were done every 2 years. So in answer to your question, the 1922 Washington treaties are an extension of 15 years before that of American war planning. What they do is try to balance the system so that the Americans, and you always get East-West confused because of the international dateline, but the Americans would have control of the area from California to Hawaii and a little bit further, and the Japanese would have control, of that of the area where they meet. And one of the restrictions was no further building in the Philippines for harbor defenses. So the Corregidor, Manila Bay defenses are essentially frozen at their 1916 level. And that also becomes one of the reasons why I would say the realists, which are the continental school, say you can't defend the Philippines. So since we're forbidden from doing that, pull back. Take those resources in the Philippines, that garrison, and pull it back to Honolulu. That's a probably overlong answer to a question, but you could fill that whole answer out for another 2 days. But
our naval colleague.
Ed Marolda, U.S. Commissions for Brian Lynn. Brian, could you elaborate a little bit about the impact of the loss of the Marianas and the Carolines as a result of World War I? How did that affect construction of forts in the Far East and the Army's deployment?
Right. That's a great question. There were these island chains between, well, it's not actually between Hawaii. There's a great shot between Hawaii and Japan, but you can't do it because of logistical problems. And so essentially the route has to come through these island chains. Formerly belonged to Spain, then they'd belonged to Germany, and then Japan took them in World War I. I would say that's sort of like Billy Mitchell. Initially, they're not seen, except by Navy officers, as changing the dynamic very much. I mean, it takes the Army a great deal of time because it's waiting for the Navy to tell it when it's going to be there. For the Army garrison, all in the Philippines, all it cares about is when are you going to get there? And how long do we have to hold out to keep Manila Bay open for you? And that's your problem. It becomes more of a problem when the Navy decides it's going to take the slow route and through those islands. But at that time, I think realistically, that decision to take a slow route and not have the sudden rush is due to Army pressure. It's the Army that threatens to go to Congress and say, the only reason for doing this is the Navy wants an aggressive force. So, this is Ed and I can, fight this out for quite a while because he reads Navy records and I read Army records and we adopt the prejudices of our sources. But it's a good question, and the answer is for the Army, we don't care just when are you going to get there.
Next question, please.
Hello, I'm Dan Zamansky of Israel. Thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. I've got a question for Professor Lynn, and sorry to make you stand up again. It relates to the what I think is a bit of an issue that you mentioned in passing, China and the U.S. presence there, and perhaps also, of course, there was Vladivostok and a brief American military presence there. My question relates to the issue of communism and Russian expansion. Of course, in this period, we see thousands of Russian officers operating undercover in China. Does this become an American concern at all? Because, the link that I see here is a sort of panic in 1946. George Marshall tries to save China from communism, if we can call it that, completely fails. And then, of course, we have a huge issue with Korea, and in some ways it lasts to the present day. So, is there a sign that this is an actual functional concern, or is this just completely laid to the side at this time?
That's another really interesting question. There was something called War Plan Yellow, but the American view was what they called the open door, that you should protect Japanese territorial integrity, and every European should have sort of equal trading rights. And obviously, the one power that threatens that is Japan. So the protection of China then gets rolled into War Plan Orange, which is a war plan against Japan. Now, there was these sort of token garrisons in Shanghai and Tianjin when it was a Marine, and the Americans actually do send a regiment to Japan. It wasn't a regiment? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Very good, Richard. China. They pull a unit out of the Philippines and they send it to China. But reading the War Plan Yellow is essentially a return to the Boxer Rebellion. How to secure the American concessions and protect American missionaries and so forth. And in fact, that was also, in many respects, a Navy job as well, because you had the Yangtze Patrol going up and down the rivers. So it's a... Now, the other half of your question is concern about communism. And that was definitely a concern. That's an internal war plan called War Plan White, which was to deal with subversives, though there's a great deal of literature arguing that the American security culture and the deep state all stems from these plans. Here's my version. A couple of Americans, during World War I, when Woodrow Wilson essentially turned the state loose on anyone who was suspected of being a subversive. And they set up, later becomes the FBI, and a great deal of surveillance. And a lot of that was run by the military. You have some pretty crazy people. Ralph Van Diemen is this sort of, if you ever want to do a demonic, master of intelligence who sees conspiracies everywhere, this guy's, and he has a long career. For 60 years, he's running this right-wing apparatus. But he's doing a lot of that. When sober officers come back from the Western Front, they look at this, and initially they're panicked. There's 500,000 commies out there, Well, you look at all these organizations. And after a while, they sort of start doing fact checks. And they said, this is crazy. And by 1921-22, the U.S. Army, it actually moves against its own internal security people. It gets rid of Van Diemen, gets rid of a lot of these people, and sort of says, we're not really worried about it. All the literature you'll read is the hysterical period. And almost none of the literature will say, wait, these guys do learn, and they say, this is a bad idea, and they stop doing it. Okay?
Are there any more questions? Yes, sir, please, take mic.
I'm Shlomi Shitrit from Israel. My question is to Dr. Ortner. The Volksheer existed for a very short time and didn't do much, if I understand correctly. What was its influence, if at all, following its disbandment?
Thank you for the question. Totally surprised someone is interested in the Austrian Volkswehr. The disbandment was a little bit of a problem because it helped, especially during the first months of 1919, quite a lot of troops coming back, and the worst thing for internal policy, soldiers who have no jobs because they're always a threat for the government, and then they have fantastic ideas like revolts or whatever, Freikorps. I think it was quite effective in reducing this danger of an internal putsch or a Bolshevik revolution, also by integrating all the lefty or extreme lefties into the Volkswehr. On the other hand, it was more or less effective in defending the Carinthian border towards Slovenia. Regarding Styria, it was not effective. The third effect was that when it was ordered to be disbanded after the peace treaty of Saint-Germain, where should these soldiers go? Not everybody was taken over by the new formed army. Quite a lot of them joined the, well, let's say, self-defense unit of the Social Democratic Party. And this is the first step into, let's say, militarization of politics in Austria. So quite a lot of former Volkswehrmen served in a party army. And this is the reason why most of the stuff I showed, they are in my museum, or in the Museum of the Republic of Austria. It's not mine. I have the honor to run. Are loans from the Social Democratic Party. So they took quite a lot of stuff and moved it directly to the party army of the Social Democratic Party. So actually, 9 months, it was effective just for stabilization, the internal policy, from my point of view.
Christian, ladies and gentlemen, this is your last chance. Do you have a question? Please, sir.
Gil Barndollar from the American Commission. This question is for Dr. Lin. An earlier question referred to racism. How much do you think that played into U.S. evaluations of Japanese capabilities, despite, obviously we brokered the peace in 1904, had observers of the Chinese communists and other views of Japanese capabilities?
Yeah. The question about racism comes up quite a bit ever since John Dower wrote his book. And his book is interesting. The only problem I have with Dower is when he argued that Americans dismissed the Japanese as as they couldn't see and they were terrible fighters and they had no initiative. The Dower used civilian sources. He didn't bother to read the war plans and he didn't bother to read the assessments. Americans did have observers in Japan, they had spies in Japan. They had, not very successful, but they had observers in China. And most of those took the Japanese army very seriously. I mean, Americans studied the Russia-Japanese War intensely. That was one of the first, in the War College, the first 10 years, it's the Germans and the Japanese is what they studied, and even afterwards, they studied that war very intensely. So they took a lot from the Japanese. It was a very pro-Japanese interpretation of that war. So you find remarks now that we would automatically classify as racist, and because we classify them as racist, we sort of dismiss the context that they're made. You see a comment like Oriental fanaticism, or the Japanese, have no, their obedience to the emperor and will die for him. And you tend to say, well, that's racism, because that's how we interpret it. They're interpreting it in many ways as a military reality. To compare to us, these people are fanatics. So I guess what I would say is when you're doing this, you have to try and put yourself in the position of someone in 1910 writing that document and ask yourself, what's he saying? And not from a position, as I see too often, of a postmodernist deconstruction. Oh, horrors, they're racist. Therefore, I dismiss them completely. It goes up and down just like any military analysis. But on the whole, they treated the Japanese as very serious opponents and often compared them far more favorably to the American public. Because the Japanese public was obedient, it was disciplined, it respected authority. The American public were a bunch of weak, commercial, decadent. Why can't our people be more Japanese? And Dower never seems to bring that part of the racist equation into his argument, I would say.